Paul Tournier was a young boy when he was orphaned. At the age of 3 months, his father, who was a priest, passed away, and at the age of 6, his mother died from breast cancer. Orphaned by the age of 6, this had a profound effect on his life, and yet it did not dissuade Paul Tournier from seeking the matters of faith. At a young age, even at the age of 12, he began to wrestle with some of the deep truths of the Bible and came to profess faith, and would later become a doctor, a medical doctor in Switzerland. But his focus of his practice was very interesting. It wasn't the typical medical practice that you would associate with someone who has an MD. He was primarily interested in helping people in a pastoral way. His rich Calvinistic theology had led him into a tradition where what he wanted to do was care for people's bodies and their souls. One of his most famous works is called A Place for You. And in that work, he describes how he had come to realize the great need for helping people who were in great turmoil. A young man who was very troubled had come to him, and after trying to work through the various problems in his life, he came to say to Tournier, basically, I'm always looking for a place, somewhere to be. Tournier would write these words. He would say, if as a child you have not known a secure home, it's very likely that you will go through life, regardless of your abode or wherever you will be, that you will not feel at home. But on the other hand, if you as a child have been secure and at home, wherever you go, you will be at home. We come to the Bible, and what we discover is that in the Bible there is a sense that we all live in a world of dislocation, that we all feel that we're not quite at home, that we all feel like we are orphans who are searching, wondering, hoping, praying, that we might find a settled place, a place where we can feel at home. The story of the Bible even begins with a story of people who are kicked out of their home, Adam and Eve, out of the garden, wandering. And the Bible is full of stories, people who are wandering, nomadic, looking for a way, looking for a city, a home, a place. We live in a world that is still full of dislocation. That we can even be in our own homes and yet not feel connected. That we can be in a room full of people and be trying to connect on our devices with other people so that we would somehow feel connected, all the while not feeling connected with the people who are right there with us. That we have this strange inability to feel at home. We're always looking for home. We're always wanting that place. We're always wanting some piece of security. And as Paul Tournier discusses in his book, A Place for You, the reality is that even if you had a secure home, or if you didn't have a secure home, there is a better home. A home that waits for you, where you can live in a place not of dislocation, but a place of connection. Jesus is about to leave his disciples, and as he's about to leave them, he says to them, I'm not going to leave you as orphans. I'm not going to abandon you. And the promise of the Bible that when you by faith come to Jesus, there is not a sense of dislocation anymore, but rather that you are given the certainty of a home, a place, a dwelling, a belonging. And in this, Jesus says that he will not leave us as orphans. Why is it that John 14 is so comforting? Why is it a passage, for me at least, it's been a passage I've often preached at funerals. It's words that have comforted people who are in a time of deep turmoil. Why is it that when you go to a senior who is failing in health, that they want to hear words like, do not let your hearts be troubled? Because these words that Jesus gives were intended for his own disciples to give them great comfort. If we just live a little while, we will know what it means to feel dislocated, uncomfortable, and uncertain about a future. And Jesus intends that he will comfort troubled hearts. If this is an age full of cardiac troubles, then Jesus has the answer. Do not let your hearts be troubled. How does Jesus bring comfort to the troubled heart? I want us to see a couple things this morning as we look at this great passage from John 14, that Jesus promises that we can find comfort in his promises. And that's the first thing we see in verses 1 through 6. He says, do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms, and if it were not so, would I have told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you? And if I'm going to prepare a place for you, I'll come back and take you with me, so that where I am, you may be also. Now this confuses Thomas, and so Thomas asks the question, Lord, we don't know the way, to which Jesus answers, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. This is how you come to the Father. Before the promises, though, that Jesus gives in this passage, he gives commands. Now, translators debate as to that first verse. Is there one command, two commands, or three commands? Different translations will translate it in different ways, but I want to suggest to you, I think the easiest way to take the verse is that it is three commands. 1, don't let your hearts be troubled. 2, believe in God. 3, believe also in me. Jesus has been troubled in his own heart. In chapter 11, when he went to the tomb of his friend Lazarus, in 11:33, he was troubled, seeing that there was such unbelief. In chapter 12, verse 27, he was troubled when he saw where this raising of his friend Lazarus from the dead was going to lead him. It would lead him to a cross. In chapter 13, verse 21, he was troubled because as he talked to his disciples, he knew there was one who would betray him. But now he resolves to bring comfort to the ones who are deeply troubled. And he says to them, I want you to notice that I am here to comfort you. Do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. Now, our troubles are fundamentally different than Jesus, no doubt about it. We're not facing the wrath of God, the punishment for sin when we have trusted in him. But in this moment, as much as we are safe and secure, as much as we have good homes, we have a good food supply, we can get medication, we have access to resources unlike any other time in history, we still feel incredibly uncertain. And it can even be little things that cause us to feel incredibly uncertain. What's worse, going to the doctor and getting a needle, or thinking about going to the doctor and getting a needle? Now, if you're like any child, the thought of getting a needle is 1,000 times worse than the actual needle. That the anticipation, the going there, the getting the arm swabbed, all those thoughts are just horrifying. And then that little prick, it's done. But the thought of what lies ahead when it's uncertain, when there's pain or when there's difficulty, it can cause such turmoil, grief, pain. And Jesus says, to imagined or real discomforts, he says, do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. What is the cure for trouble, the troubled heart? The first thing we see there is that Jesus says it's belief. You need to believe what's true and right. But what's interesting about what Jesus says is true and right is he says, believe in God, believe also in me. And embedded in that is actually a great encouragement. That in the command to believe is a great encouragement. That just as you believe in God, that you can believe in the Son who is in the same way, very nature God. That he is one with God. That in this idea, as Jesus gives these commands about how are you not going to let your hearts be troubled, it's believing that there is God the Father and God the Son, and that the God who has been working for you and for your good, the all-wise, all-knowing, all-perfect God who is working for you, is also working by going to a cross. And this is the very nature of when Jesus says, you believe in God, and you believe in me. That's a command. Believe it and hear that I'm not working in a different way than what my Father is working. As God is working for you, I'm working for you. And I want you to have that comfort, that clear comfort that I, as part of the triune God, the second person of the Godhead, that I am completely working for you in the same way that my Father is working for you. That our purpose and plan is united. And so Jesus can say, don't let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. There's an equality that Jesus has with his Father. That his unity with his Father is in plan and purpose. And as we'll see later on, he's of one substance with the Father, though he's distinct. This is the very heart of Trinitarian theology. We're getting into the deep things of God here, if you would. Because the deep things of God are intended to comfort you. Deep theology is not intended to discourage you, but to bring a calmness to the troubled heart. So don't let your hearts be troubled. What are we to believe? Well, we're believing in God and also in Jesus, and he goes on to say that in his Father's house are many rooms. Now, some of you might have the old King James, and you'll wonder, why does the King James say mansions? And that goes back to the 4th century when the church father Jerome was translating the Bible from Greek into Latin, and he used a Latin word that has just carried over into English, which means mansions, but only means in that context a dwelling place. There's no difference here. If you get the picture, it's God has a big house. And this massive house have many rooms. And these rooms are being prepared by Jesus. And this is the promise. I'm going away. And it's good that I go away, because as I go away, I'm getting everything ready for you. I'm prepping the rooms. I'm making sure that you'll be ready. And I want your hearts to be prepared by knowing that I have prepared these things for you. Now, when we think about preparations for trips, we don't just simply jump in a vehicle and decide, hey, I'm going off on a trip. We take some time, we figure out our finances, we look at locations at where we'd like to go, how we're going to get there. Is it by vehicle or is it by plane? We plan out the details of where are we going to stop, what kind of accommodations do we want, what kind of food do we want to eat, what kind of sights do we want to see. And we do all these preparations just for a vacation. Jesus says that the greatest destination that the Christian heads for, an eternity, has been prepared. There is not one detail that has been left out. There's not one piece of the plan that he has, oops, I've forgotten. No, every detail, like a well-planned trip, Jesus is preparing. I'm going to prepare a place for you. I'm getting all of the details organized and ready. And if I go and prepare a place for you, then I'm going to come back. And I'm going to take you to where I am. This ought to then suggest to us that if Jesus is preparing a place for us, shouldn't we prepare our hearts? Not that we're commanded to, not that eternity depends upon us preparing, but should not we prepare our own hearts? If we prepare so much for a vacation and a holiday and time away, why not the rest of eternity? Why spend so much energy on 70, 80, 90 years of our lives when there are 10 billion years ahead of us? That we plan for this little piece of time when there is so much more that is waiting. Wouldn't it be good now to prepare our hearts? To know what God is like, to know what eternity is like, to get our hearts ready with that vision of what lies ahead, so that as we have that vision, when trouble comes, because it will come, that vision of what lies ahead comforts the heart now. Some people have said, people who are so heavenly minded are of no earthly good. But the reality is, C.S. Lewis said this, that the people who have the best and clearest vision of the heavenly mindedness are of the most earthly good. Because the troubles of this life, they don't feel like massive waves that throw and toss them, but rather that they see that there is something that lies ahead which steadies their course even now. Do not let your hearts be troubled. And this belief then is intended to prepare our hearts. I don't think my grandma is going to watch this sermon. At least I hope she doesn't, but if she does, it's okay. A few weeks back, she had a cardiac event, which also caused a stroke. It looked like she wasn't going to survive. In those moments where life was so topsy-turvy after a cardiac event and a stroke, she wondered, is this my end? And she turned to my mother and she said, if I die before Dad does, tell him I'm going to prepare home for him. To which my mom had, I think, the best answer that anyone could have. Mom, you're not going to prepare anything. Jesus has prepared a wonderful place for you and for me and for us. That the uncertainties of death and the difficulties of this life are suddenly steadied. It's not your work that's going to prepare a future, but it's his work that prepares your future. And because of that, you can rest. Which is why, as we sang this morning, in you I rest, in you I find my hope, in you I place my trust. And so as Jesus instructs his disciples, he tells them, listen, you might feel dislocated. You might feel like you're a misfit. You might not feel like you can find that connectedness and belonging, but I want to tell you I've gone to prepare a place. And that place is for you. Because eternity isn't something that you work for to earn it, but rather it's a promise that you hold on to that is guaranteed for you. And if that's the case, then it steadies the course of the troubles of this life. That I don't have to worry about, am I good enough to get to heaven? That's gone. All of the dislocation of this life and the uncertainties of my own heart and the unsteadiness of my soul, that's dealt with. There's a steadiness. Because it's not about a location. As much as Jesus says, I'm going to prepare a place for you, the place is with the Father. Because it's not so much about the location, but the Lord. The goal is not just getting to heaven. The goal is that we would be with God forever and that we would be united with him. That salvation is not just a ticket to heaven. It's rather an eternity with a God who so loved you that he gave his own son for you. That this is the kind of preparation that Jesus is doing. I'm going to prepare a place for you. And if I go, Jesus actually makes one of the most clear statements in the Gospel of John right here about his own return. If I go, I will come again, and I'll take you home. Herein is the reality of Jesus' promise. I'm guaranteeing you that if you believe in me, I'm going to take you home. I'm not going to let you go. You're not going to get lost. But Thomas isn't comforted by these words. Do you notice that in verse 5? He says, Thomas responds to Jesus and he says to him, Lord, we don't know where you're going. I don't know this place. The only time Thomas has heard about the Father's house has been probably in John 2, where Jesus was referring to the temple. And most certainly, Jesus isn't referring to him going back to the temple. Lord, we don't know where you're going. How can we know the way? And in this come the most beautiful words of Jesus. Here we find the sixth of Jesus' I am statements in this gospel. 6 times Jesus has said, I am. He has said to his disciples, I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. And now he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Do you notice that each one of those times that Jesus said, I am, he used the definite article? Now we're going to use some grammar here. What's the definite article? The definite article is the word the. It defines that there is a specific object in mind. And when Jesus talks about who he is, he says, this is the specificity that I'm giving you. I am the one who brings comfort. I am the one who brings life. I am the one who brings light. I am the one who feeds your soul. I'm not just an option in the pantheon of gods. I am the option, the only option. There is no other option. I've come from heaven, and I've come down to earth. What other religious leader can claim that? What other religious leader can claim, I came from heaven, I know what it's like, I've come down to help you get back there? Not one other religious leader has ever claimed such a great claim. This is why Jesus can make an exclusive claim above all others. That I am the only way, the only truth, the only life. That there aren't options. It's me. This is comfort. This isn't intended to afflict your soul. It's intended to bring you relief and comfort. Because he says, I am. I am is not just some generic statement. It is a reference back to the Old Testament when God revealed himself to Moses and said, you tell them, when we were asked, who's sending you to deliver this people out of this house of bondage and slavery, you tell them, I am sent you. The very God who came to rescue a homeless, helpless people is the same God who comes in Jesus Christ to say, I am that same God to deliver you. I'm going to take you home. Just like I took Israel into the promised land, I'm going to take you home to your promised land. And your promised land is guaranteed and it's secure. And that's comforting. I am the way, the truth, and the life. So trust in him alone, which is why we can trust that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. For packed into this one verse, there is so much in verse 6. When Jesus says, I am the way, he was the one who was abandoned by his friends, who left him in his darkest hour, and yet who was the one who would reconcile his friends to God. He would say, I am the truth, when he would endure the despising shame of the lies that would be told about him, so that he might reveal God to humanity. And I am the life, as he hangs from a cross, as he's about to die and be buried into a tomb. I am the one who brings regeneration. In other words, what Jesus here is saying is, I'm the one who reconciles, I'm the one who reveals, and I am the one who regenerates. This is my work. What other religious leader can claim that he brings life and light and hope and shows you the way that brings you back to God? He's the reconciler, the revealer, the regenerator. He does all of these things so that you might be brought to God. The goal is not just heaven. The goal is being brought to God. So he can say, I am the way and the truth and the life, that no one comes to the Father except through me. Now that's a lot just in those 6 verses. But as we think about the comfort that Christ offers comfort to us that we might find it in his promises. But he also promises that we might find comfort in his power. Look at verses 7 through 11. He says, If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. Philip said to him, Lord, show us the Father, and that's enough for us. Jesus said, have I been with you so long, and you still do not know me, Philip? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Do you not believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words that I say to you, I do not speak in my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does his works. Believe me that I am in the Father and the Father is in me, or else believe on account of the works themselves. In other words, what Jesus here, if we could simply sum it up, is to say, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. You want to see what God looks like? Look at Jesus. That should be comfort enough. But Philip is confused. Verse 8 makes it very clear. He's really confused. Lord, show us the Father. That's enough. That'll be good enough. The word that Philip uses here for show has the idea of, I want a demonstration of power. I want a great display of authority. It's not unlike the person who says, Lord, I just need to see you. If you'd just put a sign in the clouds, or if you'd make all the lights on the way to work, if you'd make them green this morning, I just know you're for me. I think we chuckle because we know that we've done this. But Jesus says that's not how God is shown to you. You could have all these miraculous works, but the works that I've done, I'm already pointing to them. He says that in verse 11. If you don't believe me, look at the works I've already done. And the works that I've done, Jesus has done 7 signs already in this gospel. 7 signs that should cause belief. He's turned water into wine in chapter 2. He's taken a centurion's son who was ill and given him health and raised him. He's gotten out of the boat and walked on water. He's taken bread, 5 loaves, 2 fish, and made a feast for the crowds. He has taken a lame man and made him able to walk. He's given sight to a blind man who could not see. He's taken a dead man in a grave and called him forth to live. You want to see the works that I've done? There are 7 signs in John's gospel, he's saying. Look at what I've already done. Believe. But when Jesus responds to him, when he responds to Philip, show us the Father, what does Jesus say? Have I been with you so long and you still do not know me, Philip? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. Here Jesus says, I want you to have, it's a word that has the idea, when he talks about seeing, it has the idea of a deep comprehension. Paul will use this kind of language in Ephesians 1 in verse 18 where he'll say, I pray that the eyes of your heart would be enlightened. I want you to see from the heart. It's not these 2 eyes right here that you are having problems with. It's here. It's a problem of belief, and the work that I want to show you is I want you to see that the Father is in me and that I am in the Father. Do you see that language there of mutual indwelling? That the Father is in Jesus and that Jesus is in the Father, that there's this, here again we come back to the Trinity, the triune God, this great theology, that God is of one substance, he has one will, he has one heart, one purpose, that God the Father and God the Son are united in all that they do. This is where, through the history of the church, the deep things of God have been wrestled with so that we would find comfort and understand that the triune God is entirely working for us. But Jesus is a comfort because he's telling us, listen, you want to know what God is like? I'm the revelation of God. I'm showing you. I've been here all this time to show you what God is like. In fact, back in chapter 1, in the introduction, it's always good when we read introductions to just pay very close attention. In chapter 1, at the very end of John's introduction to his gospel, he says these words in verse 18, "No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's right hand. He has made him known." Now, in this last phrase, made him known, is the word that we get in English that is the word to exegete. So when I'm preaching here, what I'm doing right now is I'm exegeting a passage. I'm working through, mostly verse by verse, trying to explain it. In the same sense, John says here in chapter 1, verse 18, the one who's been at the Father's right-hand side, he is exegeting the Father. This is the exegetical work of Jesus. He's a preacher. And his preaching is to show the glory that was from before all time. Jesus is the exegete of God. Now you're going, okay, Andrew, this is bad. We're talking about definite articles today. And now we're talking about exegesis. How is this going to bring comfort? We might want to know Jesus through a sign. We want to know God through signs. We want to know mysterious power. But Jesus says the way that you know the Father is that you know me, because the Father and I are one. We're united. He'll make that very clear in chapter 17. He's the exegete of God. Now, what does that mean? Probably the best explanation I could give to you as to what it means for Jesus to be the exegete of God is to compare Jesus. This is a very imperfect comparison, but to compare Jesus to the Rosetta Stones. The Rosetta Stone is a large stone. It's about 115 centimeters tall and 74 centimeters wide. I have a picture of it there that you can see. And on it are three languages. There's Egyptian hieroglyphics, there's Demotic, and there is Common Greek. Up until this stone was discovered in Egypt in 1799, Egyptian scholars had a terrible time with hieroglyphics. They didn't know how to decipher the hieroglyphics of ancient Egypt. But when they came across the Rosetta Stone, the three languages they discovered, they knew very little about Egyptian hieroglyphics. They knew a little bit more about this Demotic language, but they knew a lot about Greek. And what they discovered was that as they looked at the Greek, they could translate it and understand it, and they could compare that to the Demotic and discover, oh yeah, we see the connections here. Oh, this says the same thing, just in a different language, which means that the hieroglyphics, we now have the exegetical clue that unlocks all the things that we've been looking for to understand these Egyptian hieroglyphics. And suddenly, the study of Egyptology and hieroglyphics was opened up in great ways for Egyptian scholars. In the same way, Jesus is the Rosetta Stone who unlocks the hermeneutic of the entire Bible that we would understand God. He's unlocking all of the clues. If you don't understand the Old Testament, you look at Jesus. He's the hermeneutical key that unlocks it all. He's the Rosetta Stone that helps you to translate. What's it mean? He brings light and understanding. Jesus says that he only speaks. In verse 10, don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does his works. I'm showing you the Father. I'm speaking only what the Father says. I'm that Rosetta Stone. You don't understand what God's like? Then look to me. The translation's here. It's all clear. I'm the hermeneutical key. I'm going to unlock it all. Thus, we can understand God by looking at Jesus, which gives us a great comfort. If you don't understand why God acts the way he does, look at Jesus. Study Jesus, full of grace and truth, full of compassion and love, full of the faithfulness of God who covenanted to show his promises so that we find comfort in his promises. And this is the power of God, that he shows us. The comfort of Jesus is the power to show us what God is like. But finally, not only do we find comfort in his promises and in his power, but we find comfort in Christ through prayer. Now, most of us in this room, we've launched out on our own at some time, and we've discovered that the world is big, and as exciting as it is, there's all sorts of trepidations. And suddenly we find ourselves calling home to find out some answers that we didn't know that we didn't know. that there's more that we didn't know than we realized, that the world is far more complicated than we realized, and life can be kind of tough. At times it can be kind of scary. And Jesus here, he speaks to his disciples. I'm going to take you home, but you're being launched out into a world. And this world, it feels quite disorienting to you. But he says to them in verse 12, "Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever believes in me will also do the works that I do, and greater works than these will he do, because I am going to the Father. Whatever you ask in my name, this I will do, that the Father may be glorified in the Son. If you ask me anything in my name, I will do it." Now here is the great comfort. I am leaving this world, Jesus says, but that doesn't mean that the revolution is over. The revolution that I started has not ended just because I'm leaving. In fact, if I'm leaving, it's going to mean that this revolution is going to take on worldwide implications. And the implications of this revolution are going to be world-shattering, kingdom-shaking, nations tottering. It's going to threaten political powers. It's going to be so enormous that governments will tremble. Well, what are these greater works? Is Jesus implying that the greater works that we'll do, or we're going to do greater miracles than what he's done? Well, in reading the book of Acts, we just simply know that that's not necessarily the case, is it? That the early church didn't do greater miraculous deeds than Jesus did. But what we do know is that Jesus started with 12, and one of those 12 abandoned him and betrayed him. He was down to 11. And when he left earth, he had 11 followers in that final night before his death. But when he would rise from the dead and he would meet with the disciples again, and as they would be gathered in a room together and praying, we're told in Acts 1, there was 120 of them. Not bad. That's a good increase. But from 120, they would go out with boldness, and on the day of Pentecost, Peter would preach a sermon which would be multiplied into 3,000. And in the book of Acts, what we continue to see is this enlarging of this revolution. It's moving. Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and then to the ends of the world. And today, the revolution of Jesus continues in greater ways than Jesus saw than when he walked on planet Earth. Today, the fastest growing church, the fastest growing group of believers in the world is where? Iran. In China, it is estimated that 10% of the population of China, approximately 120 million people, are believers. Jesus never saw that when he walked here 2,000 years ago. And yet you and I have the promise that if we would ask anything of his name, when we would ask of him, Lord, we've got friends, we've got neighbors, we want them to come to know you, he'll do a greater work. It's far bigger than just those 11 in that closed room on that night before he goes to the cross. There are millions and millions of people who now know and trust and believe in Jesus. And this great prayer that Jesus had, that there would be many more who would be saved, that the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest to send out people, like Rosemary had asked us this morning. There are people waiting in prisons to hear of the good news of Jesus. There are people who are longing to know of comfort and joy. There are people who are afflicted because they watch Fox News, MSNBC, whatever their choice channel of politics, and they are in turmoil because they watch what happens and they can't find any comfort in politics. And they never will. Because comfort isn't found there, it's found in Jesus. And he says, then ask anything in my name. Now, what does this mean? Okay, so I'm just supposed to ask, Lord, give me a comfortable, easy life? The key is in that phrase, ask anything in my name. And the key is that when Jesus says, ask anything in my name, you're praying in accordance with my nature. You're asking for my endorsement of what you're requesting. So when my kids ask something of me, they know that if the request is consistent with my nature, it's more likely that they're going to receive it. And Jesus has given clear explanations as to what's in his nature. And so if we ask consistently with what he's told us, then he'll give us much more. And I think the more is there are many more people to know Jesus yet. And ask specifically, name them. Pray for them by name. That's why we gave you a card a couple weeks ago and said, pray for 5 friends or family members. You believe that God could take those 5 names and transform their lives? We'll see a greater work, Jesus says, for 3 reasons. 1, it requires belief. He tells us that in verse 12, truly I say to you, whoever believes in me. It requires that we believe his promises. Second of all, it requires that we ask. It means, as Jesus says in verse 13, ask whatever in my name and I'll give it to you. Which means that we ought to trust that if he's told us to ask, that he'll honor the request to bring salvation. And as we'll see next week in verse 15, he says, if you love me, you'll obey my commands. Jesus is continuing to do a greater work than what we could have ever asked for or imagined. This weekend, I heard of a home church in China that was getting too large, and the Chinese government was getting concerned about it. So they decided to break it up. But what happened was that this home church that was getting too large, while it was broken up by the Chinese government, has now become 20 home churches. This is how the revolution of Jesus continues to spread. It brings comfort to us that in this world you will have trouble, but do not fear. Jesus says, I have overcome the world. This is why people come back to John 14 and they take great comfort in it, because when they feel dislocated in this life, when they do not feel like they fit, when they feel like the Christian belief that is driving their life is so at odds with the cultural moment, Jesus says, do not let your hearts be troubled. It's not only intended for when you're lying on your deathbed. It's intended for when you feel like you don't fit in this world. That when you don't feel like you fit in high school or university or in your job, that you can say, don't let your heart be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. That he is doing a greater work. And he's intended to comfort you so that you would not feel disoriented. Which is why this passage is the passage that people come back to over and over and over again. Yesterday when I was with my grandfather, he couldn't remember my name, 91 years old. He felt shy, which is so unusual for my grandfather. A man who's been bold, a man who's been an executive in a major business. I'm shy. Well, Papa, can we read to you a passage of Scripture? He went silent. Without any prompting or me saying anything, he began by saying these words, do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms, and if it were not so, would I have told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you? And if I'm going to prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, so that where I am, you may be also. Now the irony is that I thought he'd stop there, but he kept on going. Thomas said to him, Lord, we don't know the way. We don't know where you're going. How do we know the way? And then in my grandfather's weak, frail voice, he said these words. Jesus answered him, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me.